A librarian vanishes, leaving only one clue: a single ivory chess knight. The problem? He never played chess. For 22 years, this detail was ignored until a detective realized the knight wasn't a clue. It was a confession. Stay with me, because what it reveals will bring down an empire. A librarian vanishes, leaving only one clue: a single ivory chess knight. The problem? He never played chess. For 22 years, this detail was ignored until a detective realized the knight wasn't a clue. It was a confession. Stay with me, because what it reveals will bring down an empire. Some mysteries begin not with a shout, but with a whisper so quiet it takes years to be heard. In 1998, in the fog-draped town of Ethelberg, Oregon, that whisper took the form of a single hand-carved piece of ivory. On a Tuesday morning that smelled of damp pine and cold river water, Arthur Finch, the town librarian, drove his modest sedan toward the county archive and vanished from the world. No scream, no sign of struggle, no sound, just gone. For 2 weeks, search parties combed the dense, whispering forests that ringed the town, their flashlights cutting useless beams into the oppressive green dark. His younger sister, Eleanor, a quiet archivist herself, waited by a phone that never rang. A vigil of silence that settled into her bones and stayed there. The car was found on the 3rd week, parked neatly at a disused trailhead, leading into the Whispering Pines National Forest. The placement was deliberate, almost staged. Keys still in the ignition, doors unlocked. His wallet, untouched, sat on the passenger seat. Everything was there, except for him. It was the discovery by the responding officer, a young detective, Miles Corbin, that would become the case's single defining enigma. In the glove compartment, nestled between the owner's manual and a packet of tissues, was an object that belonged to another world. A single chess piece, an ivory knight, worn smooth with age. It was heavy, intricately carved, an artifact of strategy and conflict, and it was utterly out of place. Arthur Finch, according to everyone who knew him, his sister, his colleagues, the few friends he had, was a man of books and quiet routines. He saw life as a series of facts to be ordered and preserved. He didn't play chess. The discovery was noted, photographed, and placed in an evidence bag, a strange, silent artifact in a case that was rapidly growing cold. It was logged as miscellaneous personal item, a footnote in a tragedy that had no words. For the next 2 decades, that ivory knight would sit in a box in the Ethelberg Police Department's evidence locker, a question that no one was asking. The truth, like so many other things in that quiet town, had been filed away. The disappearance of a man like Arthur Finch left a different kind of void. He was not a community leader or a social butterfly. He was part of the town's quiet infrastructure, as reliable and overlooked as the Dewey Decimal System he so lovingly maintained. The Ethelberg Library, once a place of gentle order, now felt like a book with a missing page, a story that stopped mid-sentence. His sister, Eleanor, retreated further into her own world of paper and memory at the County Historical Society. She did not lead search parties or plead on television. Her grief was a quiet, methodical, and persistent act of preservation. She kept his small apartment exactly as he had left it, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light like silent, floating memories. It became a shrine not to death, but to absence. Every year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, she would drive her own car out to the trailhead, a place the locals had started calling Finch's Rest. She would stand there for an hour, listening to the wind move through the colossal pines. a sound that felt like the earth's own slow, somber breathing. How do you mourn someone who is simply gone? When there is no grave to visit, no final word, does hope become its own kind of prison? Detective Corbin tried, but the case was a vacuum. There was no motive. Arthur had no known enemies and no money. There was no physical evidence at the scene, no forensic trail. The car had been wiped clean, almost unnaturally so, as if the forest itself had scrubbed it of all human trace. The investigation stalled, drowned in a sea of negatives. Every interview was an echo of the last. He was a quiet man. He kept to himself. The ivory night, the one discordant note in the entire symphony of silence, was dismissed as a bizarre but meaningless trinket, perhaps a forgotten gift. Every answer was like a knife made of fog. You could feel the edge, but not see it. The case file, thick with these useless truths, was eventually moved from the active desk to the cold case cabinet in the station's basement. The silence that began that Tuesday morning in 1998 settled over Ethelberg, deep and suffocating. The mystery faded from conversation into local lore. A ghost story parents told their children about the librarian who walked into the woods and was swallowed whole. A cautionary tale about the secrets that trees keep. For Eleanor, it was not lore. It was a wound that refused to close. And the ivory night, the one detail that made no sense, the one piece that didn't fit, was the splinter of glass lodged deep inside it. A constant, sharp reminder that the story wasn't over. It had just been paused. 22 years is a long time for a question to sleep. In 2020, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, often through the relentless march of technological advancement, or the simple dedication of people who refuse to let a name be forgotten. That year, the Ethelberg Police Department, facing budget reallocations, brought in a new detective to clear its backlog of cold cases. Her name was Izzy Reyes, a sharp, restless investigator from Portland, whose reputation was built on her obsession with details others overlooked. She saw cold cases not as failures, but as stories waiting for the right reader, narratives that had been interrupted. She inherited the file for Arthur Finch, its manila folder yellowed and soft with age. She read through the reports, the witness statements, the dead ends. The story was frustratingly simple. A good man, a creature of habit and quiet intellect, had vanished. But then, her eyes fell on the evidence log. Item 7, 1-1, carved ivory chess piece, knight. Something about it snagged her attention. In a case defined by absence, this one object was a stark, undeniable presence. She requisitioned the evidence box. Sitting at her metal desk under the hum of fluorescent lights, she tipped the knight into her gloved hand. It was beautiful, the work of a master craftsman. The patina of age was deep in the crevices of the force's mane, the polished surfaces worn to a soft gleam. This was not a piece from a cheap plastic set bought at a department store. This was an object with a history, a soul. It felt dissonant with the image of Arthur Finch, the simple librarian. While others had seen a dead end, a random curio, Izzy saw the story's only loose thread. She began her work not by re-interviewing aging witnesses, but by treating the knight as her primary source. This was not just a possession. In a case with no body and no confession, This small carving might be the only witness left. It was a totem of memory, a physical link to the last moments of Arthur Finch's known life. She started with a question that Detective Corbin had dismissed 20 decades prior. A question so simple it was profound. If Arthur Finch didn't play chess, who did? And why was their knight in his car? The past wasn't gone. It had just been quiet. And Detective Reyes was about to make it loud. Detective Reyes began where the first investigation had failed, with the object itself. Using the precinct's new high-resolution digital microscope, she examined every millimeter of the ivory knight. She wasn't just looking at it, she was reading it, searching for the story it had been holding for 2 decades. Tucked into the intricate carving of the knight's base, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a maker's mark. It was not a brand, but 2 letters intertwined, A and V, a signature. The knight had a creator. Her next step was to contact a specialist, a professor of art history and antiquities at Reed College in Portland, who specialized in ivory and bone artifacts. The professor confirmed the material was old elephant ivory, likely pre-20th century. Carbon dating placed its origin somewhere in the late 1800s, but the carving style was more modern, suggesting an old piece of ivory repurposed by a 20th century artisan. This was the first contradiction. The piece was both an antique and a modern creation. The professor had never seen the AV mark before, but suggested it was the signature of a private, commissioned artist, not a commercial manufacturer. This wasn't just a chess piece. It was a bespoke work of art. The real breakthrough, however, came from the lab. A latent print specialist, using a new cyanoacrylate fuming process on the porous ivory, managed to lift a partial fingerprint from the knight's mane, a print that had survived 22 years in an evidence bag. The print did not belong to Arthur Finch. When run through the national database, it returned no match. It was the fingerprint of a ghost. But it was proof. Someone other than Arthur had held this piece, had held it with enough frequency to leave a mark that time couldn't erase. The knight was no longer just a trinket. It was a bridge, a physical link between the vanished librarian and an unknown, unseen player. The whisper was getting louder, sharpening into a word she could almost understand. The AV mark became Izzy's obsession. She spent weeks cross-referencing databases of artisans, craftsmen, and jewelers in the Pacific Northwest, a digital search for a ghost. The search was a lesson in futility until she took a different approach, digging into old pre-internet business registries and guild memberships stored at the Oregon State Archives. There, in a dusty ledger from the 1970s for the Oregon Artisans Guild, she found him. Anton Volkov, a wood and ivory carver who had a small studio in the Cascade Mountains before retiring in the late 1980s. He was a Russian immigrant, a master craftsman known for his intricate Old World style. According to the records, he was now in his late 90s and living in a managed care facility east of Bend. Izzy and her partner drove through the high desert, the landscape a stark contrast to Athelberg's damp forests. They found Anton Volkov in a sun-drenched room, his hands garnered with arthritis, but his eyes still sharp. He didn't remember much of his life. The memories faded like old photographs. But when Izzy placed the ivory knight on the table in front of him, a flicker of recognition ignited in his gaze. "The bishop's set," he whispered, his voice raspy. He explained that in the mid-1970s, he was commissioned to create 4 identical custom chess sets. The client was a wealthy man from Athelberg who called himself the Bishop. He wanted the sets made from antique ivory he provided himself, and he paid in cash. Anton never knew his real name, but he remembered the man's instructions clearly. Each of the 4 sets was to be identical, except for a tiny, unique identifier on the base of one piece, a different mark for each set. He had carved an anchor on one, a feather on another, a key on the third. The 4th set, he said, had a small, almost invisible book carved next to his AV mark. Izzy's heart hammered in her chest. The knight she held had no book. It was from one of the other 3 sets. And Anton Volkov had kept a record. In a tattered old ledger, his shaky hand pointed to a name: Lawrence Crane, the sitting judge of Ethelberg County, the town's most respected citizen. Judge Lawrence Crane was more than a man in Ethelberg. He was an institution. His family had been one of the town's founders, their name etched onto plaques and street signs. He was a pillar of the community, a man known for his sharp intellect, his impeccable reputation, and his quiet philanthropy. He was also, as Izzy quickly learned, an avid and brilliant chess player, the longtime champion of the exclusive Ethelberg Gentlemen's Club. Monsters aren't just found in basements. Sometimes they wear robes. The idea that a piece from his custom chess set had ended up in the car of a missing librarian was jarring. It was a link between 2 men who seemingly occupied different universes. The man who wrote the laws and the man who cataloged the books. Izzy arranged a meeting with Arthur Finch. In the quiet, dusty archive where Eleanor had spent 2 decades preserving her town's history while her brother's own story rotted, Izzy showed her the knight. Eleanor stared at it, her face pale. "Arthur hated games," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He said they were based on deception. He preferred the truth, things that could be ordered and cataloged." Izzy then asked a question that changed the entire direction of the case. "Eleanor, Arthur worked at the library, but you work at the County Historical Society. You deal with the town's old records. Did Arthur ever use the archive? Was he researching something?" Eleanor's eyes widened. She recalled that in the months before he disappeared, Arthur had been spending his lunch breaks at her archive, poring over old land deeds, logging contracts, and family ledgers from the town's founding era. He'd been cagey about his project, calling it a simple curiosity about local history. He was particularly interested in the Crane family and 2 other founding families, the Harts and the Prestons. He'd been using the library system to cross-reference the old documents, making notes in a strange coded shorthand that she couldn't decipher. Suddenly, Arthur wasn't just a librarian, he was an investigator. And his disappearance was beginning to look less like a random act of violence and more like a consequence. He hadn't stumbled into the woods, he had been pushed. The investigation pivoted. Detective Reyes now believed Arthur Finch wasn't a victim who stumbled into trouble. He was a player who had made a deliberate move. The key had to be in his research. With Eleanor's help, Izzy gained access to Arthur's apartment and his old computer from the library storage. It was a relic, but his files were intact. They found spreadsheets,
scanned documents, and a file named Endgame. It was filled with what looked like gibberish, a series of letters and numbers like E4, C5, NF3, D6, B5. It was meaningless to Izzy, but when she showed it to a chess expert, he identified it instantly. It was algebraic chess notation, the modern system for recording and describing the moves in a game of chess. Arthur Finch, the man who hated games, was fluent in the language of the most strategic game in the world. He was using it as a code. Each game in the file corresponded to a date, and each move corresponded to a specific page and line number in the old county ledgers Eleanor had shown him. Arthur had created a brilliant cipher. He was using the language of his adversary to document their crimes. The game of ghosts had begun. Slowly, painstakingly, Izzy and Eleanor began to translate. The Endgame file was a shadow ledger. It documented a century of corruption, a secret pact between Ethelberg's founding families, orchestrated by the Crane family to systematically defraud the county of valuable timberland, mineral rights, and water access. They had hidden their transactions, laundered their money, and silenced their opposition for generations. The quiet librarian hadn't just been reading history. He had been uncovering a war. Arthur had found it all.
In chess, zugzwang is a situation where a player is put at a disadvantage because they are compelled to make a move, but any move they make will only worsen their position. Detective Reyes realized that Judge Lawrence Crane was now in zugzwang. He didn't know that she had the knight or that she was deciphering Arthur's code, but the renewed police interest in a 22-year-old case would have put him on high alert. Izzy needed more than a historical conspiracy. She needed to connect the judge directly to Arthur's disappearance. She needed to know what happened that day in 1998. The focus returned to the other 3 custom chess sets made by Anton Volkov. According to the old ledger, one had been sold to Judge Crane. The other 2 were sold to the patriarchs of the Hart and Preston families, both of whom were now long dead. Izzy obtained a warrant to search the sprawling Crane family estate, a historic home on a hill overlooking Ethelberg. In the judge's private study, a room paneled with dark wood and lined with law books, they found it. A magnificent, antique chess table stood by the window. On it sat an ivory chess set gleaming in the soft light. But one piece was missing: the white knight. When Izzy presented her own ivory knight, the one from Arthur Finch's glove box, it was a perfect match. It slid into the empty square on the board with a soft, definitive click. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the dust of old crimes. The judge watched her, his face an unreadable mask of composure, but Izzy could see a flicker in his eyes. It was the look of a king who realizes, far too late, that he is cornered. His opponent had made a move 22 years ago, and it had only just landed. The discovery of the matching set gave Izzy the leverage she needed, but Judge Crane was a formidable opponent, protected by decades of power and respect. He stonewalled, claiming the knight must have been stolen from his home years ago. A plausible lie, impossible to disprove. The partial fingerprint from the knight remained a dead end, not matching the judge or anyone in the system. The case was balanced on a knife's edge. The breakthrough came from Eleanor. While helping Izzy sort through Arthur's belongings, a process of painful remembrance,
she found an old library book on loan to her brother, a history of famous chess matches. Tucked inside was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a checkout slip from the library's old system, dated the day before Arthur vanished. On the back, in Arthur's neat, precise hand, was a single line of his chess code: 1, E4, NH6. The chess expert told Izzy it was an unusual and somewhat passive opening move for black, known as the hippopotamus defense, where the pieces are developed slowly behind the first rank. But it was the note below it that was crucial: his gambit, my final move. Arthur knew he was in danger. He knew the judge was making a move against him. His disappearance wasn't a panicked retreat. It was a planned action. He drove his car to the trailhead, a place he knew would be found, and he left the night, Crane's night, as a deliberate message. It was a piece taken from his opponent's board, a declaration that he knew who his adversary was. He was telling the world in the only language he could, Judge Crane did this. He was sacrificing himself, his queen, to expose the king. The pieces were all on the board: the code, the night, the motive. Izzy brought Judge Crane in for a formal interview. This was not an interrogation. It was a game. She didn't accuse him. She laid out the story, Arthur's story, move by move. She talked about the secret ledger Arthur had uncovered. She spoke of the chess notation. She ended by placing the single checkout slip on the table between them. His gambit, my final move, she read aloud. The judge remained silent, his hands steepled, a portrait of judicial calm. But his composure finally broke when Izzy slid a photograph across the table. It was a high-resolution image of the partial fingerprint lifted from the ivory knight. "We couldn't match this print to anyone in the system, Judge," Izzy said quietly. "Not until we got a warrant for your family's records. It doesn't match you. It matches your son." The judge visibly flinched. His son, a troubled man who had died of an overdose a decade ago, had a juvenile record. His prints were on file. The ghost from the evidence bag finally had a name. Judge Crane's carefully constructed world collapsed. He confessed. He explained that the bishop was the code name his grandfather had used to run their secret syndicate. He had discovered Arthur's research and confronted him, seeing it as an intellectual challenge, a game. He never intended to kill him. He had sent his son to intimidate Arthur, to retrieve the research. But the confrontation escalated. His son, unstable and violent, had killed Arthur in a fit of rage. The judge, to protect his family's legacy and his son, had orchestrated the cover-up. He personally wiped the car clean and disposed of Arthur's body in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the national forest. He left the night behind, a single arrogant mistake, a souvenir from the game he thought he had won. The truth was so much worse than anyone had ever imagined. The confession led them to a remote, overgrown logging road deep within the Whispering Pines National Forest. After 2 days of searching with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar, they found the site. The Earth, after 22 years, finally gave back what it had taken. The remains of Arthur Finch were recovered, allowing him at last to have a proper burial, a final cataloging of a life that had ended in violence, but refused to be erased. The truth, when it came out, tore Ethelberg apart. The story of the town's founding families, of Judge Crane's secret reign, was a scandal that made national news. The pillar of the community was revealed to be the keeper of its darkest secrets. Lawrence Crane was arrested. His trial a somber spectacle that laid bare a century of quiet corruption. The Hart and Preston families, their modern-day descendants implicated by Arthur's coded ledger, faced a barrage of civil lawsuits and federal investigations. The town's entire history was being rewritten, its foundations shaken to the core. The quiet librarian, the man no one really knew, had, from beyond the grave, brought down an empire. He had proven that no secret is safe, no matter how powerful its keeper, when one person decides to look closely enough. The forest wasn't finished, but it had finally surrendered its ghost. In the aftermath, Eleanor Finch became the unexpected guardian of her brother's legacy. She worked with Detective Reyes to fully decode the Endgame file, creating a comprehensive document that was entered as evidence in multiple trials. She found a strange peace in the work, in the methodical ordering of the truth her brother had died to uncover. She was no longer just preserving the past. She was ensuring it was corrected. She learned that her brother, whom she had always seen as timid and reclusive, was a man of immense, quiet courage. He had faced down a powerful and dangerous enemy, armed with nothing more than his intellect and the resources of a small-town library. He had played a game he knew he couldn't win in the conventional sense, but he had ensured that the truth would be his checkmate. The town of Ethelberg began to heal, but it was a different place. The trust was gone, replaced by a more cynical, knowing awareness of the darkness that can hide beneath a placid surface. The Ethelberg Gentlemen's Club was disbanded. The street signs bearing the Crane family name were quietly taken down, erased from the map, just as Judge Crane had tried to erase Arthur Finch from the world. The act of remembrance became its own form of resistance. Some mysteries don't end with courtroom confessions.
They end in the quiet moments that follow, in the changed landscape of a life or a town. For Eleanor Finch, the end came a year after the trial, on a crisp autumn day. She stood in the newly renamed Arthur Finch Memorial Library. In the main reading room, a small plaque had been installed. It read, "In memory of Arthur Finch, who believed that the truth, properly catalogued, is a form of justice." In a glass case beside it sat a single worn ivory knight. It was a reminder that the most significant battles are not always won by the loudest warriors, but sometimes by the quietest strategists. Arthur's story became a new kind of local lore, not a ghost story, but a testament to the power of one person's refusal to look away. Sometimes healing doesn't look like a happy ending. Sometimes it looks like understanding the true meaning of a life long after it has ended. Justice had been served, but it had come late, carved from ivory and sorrow. And in the end, Arthur Finch, the man who was once a footnote, had become the author of the entire book. His name would not be forgotten. The story of Arthur Finch reminds us that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's a quiet, persistent whisper in a library archive, a single person who decides that the truth is worth fighting for, even if they're the only one in the battle. What do you think? Can one person's quiet integrity truly change the world? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching Unfound. Your viewership helps us continue to uncover these hidden narratives. Don't forget to subscribe to Unfound and hit the notification bell, so together we can make sure no name stays forgotten.